Yeah, we're going live now.
Okay. Thank you very much, and welcome everybody to this discussion with author Garth Japhet on his book Like Water Is for Fish. So Garth, hi. We'll just wait a few more minutes as people join, and then I think we'll have a really good discussion. I'm looking forward to today.
Great, thanks Paula. Me too.
And welcome to everyone who's joining. It'd be lovely to hear who's on today's chat. So perhaps if you could just introduce yourself in the chat and let us know who you are, if that's possible. And yeah, great. So good to see everyone. I see everyone's beginning to introduce themselves. And I'm hoping that we're going to get quite a nice representation, Garth, from across the continent, because I know that quite a number of storytellers from across the continent are also quite interested in hearing what you have to say. And some familiar names, of course.
So Paula, this is obviously unaccustomed as I am to this thing. I'm playing around here with light. It's a little bit of a challenge to make. What is it? This is where one needs that. What's that software that makes you look wonderful?
You need a filter, Garth. You need a
yes,
filter.
I need a filter. I need a filter. I'm sure there's a business in that.
Yeah.
But so forgive me if this still seems to. Does that? Yeah, that sort of rubs out the wrinkles, doesn't it, Paula?
And there are many, so it's doing a really good job.
yes. So thanks for that. We're off to a good start.
Yeah, absolutely. And it looks like we've got quite so welcome everyone. We've got a really good showing this evening. I want to start because we have an hour in which to discuss a book that really I'm going to highly recommend that if you haven't read it already, that you get a copy of it as soon as you can. So my name is Paula Frey. I am a media trainer and a facilitator, and I work across the African continent, really working to change the narrative of how we write about Africa, how we see Africa, and who we write about on the African continent. Now, even if you don't know Garth, you certainly know his work. Soul City and Soul Buddies are a global benchmark for behavior change communication, and really it sets the program sets the standard for others in the field in terms of the way it integrates health topics with really compelling storylines on TV, on radio, in newspapers and magazines, right? And they're so popular that they entertain even as they inform millions of people. I have to tell you how I met Garth. I first met Garth when I was the Star's medical reporter many moons ago. And then I think more than a decade later, I met Garth when I met Garth at Heartlines after he had left Soul City, and in 2006, I met him when he was doing a program, the Heartlines 8 Weeks, 8 Values program, and really used films to spark a national conversation on values. And I have to tell you, at that stage, I already knew the power of journalism. I knew the power that words had and their ability to be able to affect change. But when I worked with Garth over those 3 months working on the Heartlines national conversation, I was absolutely hooked with the power of storytelling. And I've been following his work really closely ever since. And really, in fact, learning a lot more and using the work that he does in training development communicators and people who want to use storytelling for change. And so now Garth is finally the author of a book that will really change the way you think about storytelling. It is a book that is part memoir, part instruction manual for those of us wanting to change the world. And the title, Like Water Is for Fish, really comes from this quote by Jonathan Gottschall. And I'm actually quoting it straight from his book here. Story is for human as water is for a fish, all encompassing and not quite palpable. And so really on that note, Garth, I want to ask you, why this book and why now?
Well, thanks so much, Paula. What you didn't say is that I was 10 when I met you and you were 8. We were both child prodigies working at that time. So it's nice now that we're in our mid-30s to have this conversation. So yeah, why this book and why now? It was one of those things where I suddenly realized just how much I'd learnt about the power of story, about really grappling with my own story and where I'd come from, how story had impacted on my life, and then, you know, more recently about just the power of getting to know other people's stories. And I suppose, and you know, what is it, the phrase is that something, fools go where angels fear to tread. So, you know, a lot of people say, how about, you know, you should write a book. And then you think, hey, that's a great idea, you should write a book. And so it was really, I suppose I wanted to take myself on a journey of discovery about story and the power of story and how it had affected me. And I realized that to do that as a sort of academic treatise, and I'm a very poor academic, would be crazy. If you can't tell stories about story, then why write about stories? So it was a sort of meeting with Pan Macmillan, and then, yeah, it was being put together with an extraordinary editor, Alison Lowry, to whom this book would never have seen the light of day without. So that was the sort of genesis about 3 years ago.
And you know, it's really, really interesting about what I love about your book, Garth, is that it's very visual, that there are really kind of episodes in it that come to life for me and make the theory of storytelling for change really come alive. But I want to kind of take you right back to your own story, and again a quote from the book. I'm afraid I've written all over my copy. It's sacrilege, I know, but I have.
It is
And really, this quote: in a 2 a.m. epiphany, I was struck by how stories, like some kind of hidden power, had choices, my beliefs, and sense of purpose. Tell me about the story of your own life. I mean, it really is the core of the book, but I'd love to hear you tell it in your own words again.
Sure. So and then we'll get on to global warming after that, will we, Paula? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I think the genesis of this book and the genesis of my story was essentially, which I do deal with a little bit I deal with in this book, was a little boy that basically was very anxious and insecure, who manages to drop out of nursery school and then makes a habit of it after that. Sort of ends up in lots of different schools over a period of the next 5 or 6 years. And strangely, I have never been bullied. I mean, if I was a bully, I would bully me, but I've never been bullied. So my reasons for changing schools often had to do with some really strange stuff that I just couldn't explain at the time, which was just deep anxiety, homesickness, etc. And that sort of led me, age 13, to have felt like a complete failure. In that year, I had managed to, I think, drop out of 3 schools. And it was that sort of real sense of having let my family down, my friends down, that I wanted to be something. I wanted to prove that I was okay. And it was in the pages of a series of books. And I, grew up quite a bookworm. I, from a young age, immersed myself in the world of story. And as so many of us can and do, is this, story has this ability to transport us into other worlds. And we inhabit the characters of those stories. And I found myself reading this group of stories, The Jungle Doctor. And it's about this, written by a man in the 50s. He wasn't in his 50s, but it was written in his 50s. And it was about his experiences of being a doctor in East Africa. And it was very, it was like Boy's Own adventure and saving people. And I just got completely taken in by these stories. And I'd like to say that it was, I sort of thought I could help people, but actually I saw, Dr. Japhet as being a hell of a lot less of a failure than Garth Japhet with spots, braces, and 3 years out of school, or 3 schools in a year. So it really captured me and set me on the path that you know, wanted to be Dr. Japhet. There were a couple of obstacles in the way. I fainted the sight of blood, and still get squeamish. My first baby I delivered, I dropped. Fortunately, somebody was there to catch. And I'm not very good at science or maths. So I was the most unlikely doctor. But as I say in the book, a power of a dream, of a story that you see yourself in is a very, very powerful thing. So I think that's the genesis of my story, was sort of how in many ways a story grabbed me, rescued me, gave me a vision of who I could be. And it was that I sort of stuck to like a drowning man through medical school, amongst other things.
I mean, it resonates so much with me. You know, I mean, I too kind of, I really relate to that idea of stories taking you out of the world that you're growing up in, and the ability to see yourself in another world, in other possibilities, etc. Which really, in some ways, kind of takes you to, I think, what really is one of the powerful lessons of your book, which is the power of actually knowing your own story, right? God, I want to pause for a minute, and I don't want to give too much of your story away, because I think it's really important that people read and discover it for yourself, because it really underpins the book. But there is a huge amount of vulnerability that you show the reader in telling your story. And as a writer, I can imagine that must have been really difficult. But tell me, what is the power of doing that, of sharing that with your reader? And what is the power then, a second question, of the story itself?
Well, you know, I do think that when I read a story and I see realism, and I feel the integrity of the writer or people's experiences, that's really important. But for me as well, I suppose still in my altruistic moments, I'm still very much a doctor. And I believe that being vulnerable about who we are is an important gift that we give to others. And I hope I've done it in such a way that is not woe is me, because I have no woe is me. But I think, you know, so many of us look at each other and see a picture. We see a caricature, we see a successful person or a this or a that. And I believed it was really important to really share with people parts of the difficult parts of my story, because I'm hoping, and thankfully I've already found that with this book, is that it gives license to others to be vulnerable. It gives license to others to speak about things like mental health. You know, I have coined the phrase, but by the way, I will be happy if anybody else uses, which is stuffed head syndrome, which is a nice collection of mental illness issues from which I suffer and am medicated, as I point out, for the protection of the masses. But I do, you know, feel that vulnerability is part of what I wanted to do with this. Having said that, it was very scary. You know, putting yourself out there and is not something that is easy.
It's an essential part, I think, because I mean, one of the first big moments, I think, in this book is your own discovery or your own realization of your own story. And you really talk about the power of knowing your own story. And so do you want to chat a bit about that?
Yeah, so Paula, I mean, I was lucky and fortunate, whatever the word may be, that a lot of that people have come into my life at certain times that seem to be pretty miraculous in some ways. And I was encouraged by a pastor, Andrew Luke, to actually go and take time out, to go and spend time in retreat. And I'd thought, you know, retreat meant I'd figure it all out, you know, give me a week, I'd be with some guru, the guy would sort my life out, and that would be that. And as I describe in the book, the experience was very, very different from that. And the prime thing that he got me to do was actually to spend time retracing my own story. And you know, I was in my sort of mid to late 20s, and I needed to try and understand what had happened. You know, why had I fallen off the rails? Not in a awful way, but just what was this all about, and what road it has taken me on. And also, had I made a mistake? You know, I was a very unlikely doctor. And what I learned about that is that when you go back into your own life, and I think many of us never get the opportunity or never actually take the time, it feels very sort of like, you know, self-indulgent. But actually and I learned from one of the people I interview in this book, Debbie Kirsten, this concept of, you know, seeing the troughs of your life and turning it around, and actually understanding that those were high points, that without those troughs, there wouldn't have been, you know, you wouldn't be where you are. And so as much that for me was, I wouldn't be sitting talking to you today and hopefully sharing some things which I hope would inspire and help others, if I hadn't been able to understand and reshape in some ways my own narrative, to take it from what felt like failure and understand that actually it was not failure. It was a launching pad for something else. And I hope that it's one of my objectives with this book, is to really encourage people to, you know, just, it can be scary and it may feel self-indulgent, but to spend a bit of time reflecting back on their own story, because it's not self-indulgent. It actually can be exceptionally empowering.
Could you just pause for a moment and just speak to us a little bit about the impact of stories on the way we see ourselves and also the way we see others?
Yeah, you know, why I chose that title for this book, Like Water is for Fish, is that, you know, as I've tracked back and looked at it, etc., is that the concept is that story is all around us and it's shaping us all the time. And because it's so ubiquitous, we're not aware of it. But the power of story, we're emotional beings, and I delve a little bit into that in this book around the neuroscience of story. But essentially, we make decisions, we see the world as a result of our emotions. Facts are a small part of that. And so we are shaped by the stories that we encounter. We are shaped by our family story. We're shaped by our country story. And again, I delve in a little bit about how, as South Africans, we, you know, for good and for evil, are shaped by our history. And it's part of understanding who we are as a nation. That is why it's so essential that we actually understand the history of our country, because it is foundational to understanding our present. You know, if you don't understand your history, you can't understand your present. If you can't understand that, you can't look at the future. So now, yeah, just in my own life, my faith story has obviously been an important part for me. It's not an accident that all the great faiths are based on story, because since we crawled out of caves, that's how we've passed on wisdom. We are hardwired for story. So, you know, a lovely quote, which again, I quote in the book, and now no one has to buy this book because I've told them everything about it anyway. No, that's not true. So buy the book. It's from Exclusive Books. You get a really good deal. Tell them I sent you, and ask for a discount, which they won't give you. Anyway, sorry, that was a sponsor's pitch, but there's a lovely quote in this book, which is from a meeting I had with a director in Hollywood about, I don't know, 25 years ago. And he said to me, America is today what Hollywood portrayed it to be 20 years ago, i.e. the stories that had been spun and cast by the small group of scriptwriters became the popular narrative. You know, we tend to behave towards what we think is normal. And those narratives, you know, Will and Grace, Bold and the Beautiful, Days of Our Lives, do absolutely not represent everyday living, but they became so entrenched in our psyche that they actually tell us that that is normal. And then we start to behave towards the normal, which can be a really good thing. And that's why I think, you know, using story through Soul City and Heartlines, but it can be used for evil as well. And we've seen plenty of that.
Then I loved finding Dr. Agricluster in your book. and just kind of seeing him come to life again, you know, just hearing him speak and speak to you about it. I mean, so you really kind of move from your personal story, and then the shift while you're a doctor at Alex Clinic, to begin to think about the power of storytelling as a changer, as a health tool. And then going to Seoul, and then going to the Sowetan, and then the Sowetan actually, that amazing moment when Rory Wilson and Dr. Cluster actually, you know, listened to your idea of doing a TV show and offered to pay your salary for 3 months. I mean, that must have been a defining moment, right, in your life. When you look back at the time, I mean, were you anticipating that impact, or was it that compelling story that just burned so brightly? I mean, I think one of the lines that you have is this: sometimes the story burns so brightly that even seemingly insurmountable obstacles just kind of fade into the distance. Was it a moment like that when you decided to do 3 months conceptualizing Soul City?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a bit of a surreal experience. You know, I was just a junior doctor working in a clinic in Alexandria Township, and I had these weird ideas. And you know, he, as you know, was an extraordinary man, Dr. Agri Cluster, and was the sort of founder of nation building. And we were living through this extraordinary time in our country where I think we, in the early, you know, those of us that lived through it in that period leading up to 94, there was a real desire to look around and do things in a different way. And so I think if I'd pitched this idea even a couple of years earlier, it would have fallen flat. And so, you know, that's not my brilliance. That's just, you know, thank you, God, or whatever, in terms of timing. And, you know, once, yeah, I suppose one of the things that I am, I suppose, known for, grateful for, whatever, is that once I have an idea, I tend to stick with it until such time as the doors get not just slammed shut, but bolted, and, you know, there's a big nuclear bomb on the other side. So in many ways, it was for me a lifeline, because I couldn't see myself being a medical doctor working in pediatrics for the next, you know, 40 years. So I had to make this work. And so that was a sort of, yeah, that was my lifeline. And again, lots of God instances, coincidences that happened that allowed this to sort of gather momentum. I've obviously always hoped that it would be something significant, but I was surprised by what it became.
Yeah, I just want to remind everyone who's on the web on the webinar that we will in fact be taking questions in about 10-15 minutes time. So please put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll pick them up later on. I want so I love that individual look at the impact of storytelling, the need to actually unpack our own story, the use of storytelling for a bigger audience. But then Heartlines, and I only discovered when I read the book that was going to be named Heartlands, and yet it feels like Heartlines is just absolutely the right name for it. But Heartlines was really about getting an entire nation, using storytelling across an entire nation, and then now I'm looking at not only the way we see ourselves, but, you know, what's your story? Getting people to find out the stories of others. And could you talk a little bit about that progression in the way your work has actually evolved?
Yeah, well, I mean, the name was I think it was Heartlands, and we thought it was a great name. And then we found out that it was what they would call an adult store in Hillbrow. I often think that if we'd you know, stayed in that business, we might be quite profitable today. But fortunately, we did. And Heartlines is essentially it's what connects us. It's the Heartlines. And yeah, so the move really from health for me was really understanding that I'd stumbled on the power of story to change us, and that although the big, you know, through Soul City involved in some of the big health issues like HIV/AIDS and others, is that ultimately it all comes down to how each of us show up as individuals every day. it's many of us, you know, have lofty values around what we think we hold dear, you know, integrity, compassion, forgiveness, you know, self-control, all sorts of things. And yet there often is a huge gap between what we believe and what we do. And I thought that, you know, and I tell a little bit of that journey of how I got to the place of realizing that if we could challenge people, because ultimately people are the building block of society. You know, we look at government and we look at structures, and absolutely they are critical, but actually it is about how each of us behave every day in our lives with our relationships. And so the genesis of Heartlines was very much the desire to tell stories which would challenge and inspire us to be our better selves. You know, I just sort of quote, I love the film Chariots of Fire, or films like that, where you come out of it and you're inspired to be greater than you are. And story has the ability to do that, to inspire us to be something that, you know, to take us to higher heights. And so that's, and the things we've put behind it, because I like to talk about those stories as being almost like the tip of a spear. It creates the opportunity, but it's what we put behind it. The resources, the opportunities, the methodologies, the things people can do once they've been inspired by those stories. That was the sort of genesis of the Heartlines idea.
In the book, you really talk about, shaping, knowing your own story, but then also about framing, you know, the poverty of assumptions, the assumptions we make, the way, I suppose, stories are framed, the way they're constructed, the way they're recounted to other people, and the way we're received. And we live in a time of social media that is quite reductionist, where we kind of reduce people to tropes, to stereotypes in many ways, where the conversation can be quite binary. You know, you're either with us or you're against us. And in this environment, you're actually challenging people to, and again, I mean, I keep on, I'm bringing out different quotes, because some of them just kind of like really are powerful, and I've written them down in my diary. But, you know, you're saying, as we cross paths with one another through life, you know, perhaps we should stop, look left, look right, and then listen. You know, I mean, and so even though you're talking about storytelling, even though you're talking about the power of a story, you really are talking about listening more than speaking, to kind of hear what other people say. Are you asking for too much in this era of social media?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it's you know, it's not about stopping and listening to everyone. You know, we none of us have the capacity to do that. You know, we'd be exhausted if we did that every day, all the time. But I think there were sort of two key things that had sort of happened to me, which actually writing this book and reflecting on my life really, and the one obviously was when I was in Alex and I'd had a pretty horrific night, and there was a sort of, yeah, I explained the story of essentially war in Alexandria, and how as a young doctor I was alone there with these casualties, and a returned exile, an extraordinary older doctor, had come in the following morning and had assumed that I'd made decisions because I was white, and my patients were black, and just the deep pain that I felt of, he doesn't know me and yet he has judged me. It gave me a little bit of insight what it must be like for many South Africans, and has been for many, many years, to be stereotyped simply on the basis of what you look like. And then another example which happened to me in Ireland, which I talk about in the book, but is is that we do, I suppose it's human nature, we continually make assumptions about each other based on our, you know, what we sound like, what we look like, where we dress, etc. And I think I put one step before the listen. It's to ask, is to just ask a little bit more about the lives, or that, you know, it doesn't have to go deep. But I actually say, you know, Paula, we've known each other since I was 10 and you were 8, or something, or the other way around. Is, you know, I've never asked you the origin of your name. You know, and when you just little things like that, all the way through to let's sit down and have coffee and tell me not your CV, but all about you. is that when I do that, I'm doing a couple of things. Number one is I'm saying, Sawubona, I see you. You are worthy of being seen. And it's even that guy at the traffic light who's bugging you. If you actually just roll down the window and say, hi, what's your name? You don't have to give him money. And that's where the listening comes in, because I've found I'm very good at asking. I'm not so good at listening. But when we do listen, so many of our assumptions around who the other person is are just actually quite dramatically turned on their head.
Yeah. So Garth, how are you hoping people will use the book? What are you hoping that they'll do with it?
The book.
The book.
Yeah, this is the time where we put the book up there. And again, thank Exclusives for very much for hosting this. And it is available in your local Exclusive books. So, there's sort of three. First of all, I'm hoping, and I've heard, I've had some really nice feedback that this will be a read that people enjoy, because I think there's too much weighty stuff out there, and we're living in a rough world, and so hopefully there's a bit of humor in there, but there's also, there's stuff that I'm hoping people will sort of take away into their own lives. The extraordinary gift it is to yourself when you look at your own story and perhaps just frame some of what you think was a disaster and maybe relook at that. And then secondly, the imperative of getting to know other people's stories. I mean, What's Your Story, which is a Heartlines project, is all about this, about taking this into the workplace, into schools, into churches. Is that even people who look the same of us, other middle-aged white guys, I think we're all, you think we're all the same. We're not all the same. And it's the desire to just get people to say, hey, that's something I can really do to actually change the world, is just simply to be a bit more interested in people and get to know a little bit more about them. And then the third would be just the power of using story. I mean, if you want to sell a vision, if you want to do anything that influences, there was that famous Dale Carnegie book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. I can write to you one line, it's tell a story and believe the story that you're telling. So I'm hoping that and the voices of the 20 or so people, including Zapiro and the lead singer Zolani from Freshly Ground and others that are in the book, will inspire people in that way.
And I wonder if you could just expand on that. So you've got Superior, in fact, you've got a number of different people sharing their stories, or whose stories you're sharing. Why did you choose them? What do they bring to the book?
Well, I suppose I wanted to just give people a sense that this wasn't just my own experience of story, that actually when you look around, there are many people who whether knowingly or unknowingly have stumbled or have been intentional about using story. I mean, Paula, your trade is story and teaching people how to craft them. So some of the people I knew, a lot of them I did, some of them I didn't. Like there's a whole stream of psychology called narrative psychology. So I, Googled narrative psychologist Johannesburg, and so Lauren came up, and I was able to interview her about the work she does. And, obviously inspired by stuff like Zapiro does. He tells a story in one picture, and so was able to talk to him about his, thoughts on this. And Tina Schlope, who is, the doyen of storytelling in South Africa. And, a range of people, pastors who used What's Their Story in their church. Stephen Mzee, who's from Kenya, who pastors a church in Cape Town, who used the Heartlines, What's Your Story program. And he realized that I can't get other people to share their stories if I don't share my own. And he shared with his big congregation his own story. And he says it was one of the most transformatory times of his ministry, is that suddenly people saw him as vulnerable, as a man who'd struggled, etc. So there's a bunch of people. Some are known, as I say, some are famous, some are not. But all of them, in one way or another, sort of illustrate one or more of these story points.
And I just have to say that one of the really nice things about this book, which is essentially about storytelling, is that that you use the device of storytelling in order to share the lessons learned. And so sometimes we're at the scene, we're at the Heartlines boardroom table, listening to staff talking. We're with you on your retreat. We're with you in Kenya when when you're a medical student and you're going off to work. With someone for the first time, and we're with you in your disappointments and your challenges and everything. And then sometimes we're seeing things through your eyes. We're experiencing them via you, and then sometimes we're just learning about the process of it. I know that you pay tribute to your editor Alison Lowry, and so it's really interesting to see how that comes together for those storytellers in the audience who really kind of want to see how these things can really come together. Garth, the book feels like an appetizer. It feels like it's a scene setter for the next one in some ways. At the end of it, you really want to see more, read more, consume more. I find myself going back to specific instances or specific stories, and I'm wondering what is next for you. What are you working on now?
Paula, when you said that, I had this like sick feeling, about like, when's your next book?
I'm afraid that was what I was asking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, essentially, unless I, imbibe too much or whatever. Look, I again pay tribute to Pan Macmillan and especially to Alison, who was able to. I suppose what I'd learnt was I love great writing, and when I read great writing, I recognize it. And then I read some of my own thing and think, oh, gracious, this is absolutely revolting. And then to have somebody like Alison come along and just sort of like, she was more counselor. I mean, she's an amazing editor, but counselor. Garth, you can do this. Just do the next chapter. So I think, I certainly on the book front, this is very new for me, and the objectives, as I say, are fairly clear in terms of, this is not skit and donna. It might do better if it was, but this is very much a call to people to rediscover what is essentially as old as humanity itself. This is not new. Nothing that I'm have exposed here is sort of 21st century stuff. So I'm going to sort of keep on keeping on, and if the feeling comes that there is another part to this, then we'll have a look at that thing. But right now it's great talking to you, Paula, and that's where we'll leave it for the moment.
It's the power of storytelling. You've created a need. So I'm going to go over to the Q&As now and just recommend that if anyone has some questions, just to put it in there. And the first one really is from Lindy Officer, who says, your honesty and transparency is so encouraging. Garth, bearing your soul is never easy. Do you attribute your journey to being open to God's plan for your life and your willingness to follow that plan?
Yeah, I mean, clearly my faith is part of who I am. As I say, I battled with this existential crisis of, what are we here for? I think at some point we all have to sort of say, well, what's this all about? Are we just a collection of atoms, and is it all purposeless, etc. So I think what my faith does do is not to take myself too seriously, and to understand that what I have managed to do is often not because of me, but despite me, and therefore to be too sort of either closed about it or very thing, I can say, gee, isn't that amazing? I mean, flip, who'd have thought? And so I think to be sort of honest in that way around believing that, for all of us, believe, whether we believe it or not, there is meaning, and part of my meaning and my God-given meaning has been to do this work. And there's no greater satisfaction in life to feel that you are doing what you were created to do. And again, for that, many people can't say that, and for that I'm supremely grateful.
Mm. Thanks, Garth. And thanks for that question, Lindy. So we've got another question here from Matthew Amolo from the AfriChild Center. And he's saying that storytelling is a powerful tool for behavior change. So how can the scientific community, the scientific research, tap into these uniquely placed tools to communicate to communities? Yeah, I'd love to hear that too.
So, I mean, Paula, as you know, one of the great frustrations of my life has been that the scientific community doesn't understand that there's actually very hard science behind story. The work we do is deeply embedded in theory and in research, and we listen. Key to what we do is listening. We start off on the basis that we don't know. We spend our latest, talk about what's next. Well, there's a lot in Heartlines. One of them is a big intervention around fatherhood called Fathers Matter. And we've spent over a year actually trying to understand this by speaking to people, running focus groups. And so the scientific community, there's a sense, and it's happened again with COVID, is that everybody is a communicator and a social change expert. You just got to call up the local ad agency and they're your people. It's very different trying to shift behavior than getting somebody to, buy your latest cell phone. So I think there's still, and I recount the episode that I had in Davos with the Gates Foundation and with Richard Branson, where, trying to get across that this is not fluffy. This is as important as vaccines. And, part of the work I'm involved in at the moment is talking about COVID and vaccines and understanding where people's barriers are. So I think, again, maybe this will be a small contribution to making this understood that this is a serious science. It's as studyable and as measurable as a lot of other sciences. So I think that's a key thing for me. And I'm hoping that people will take that out of this, that this is not hokey.
It's always interesting to me how we don't recognize the change developed or the change brought about by stories in our lives, right? I mean, the behavior change, the way we live now very often is a result of stories that we've told previously, and we don't make that connection. So thank you for that question, Matthew. Our next question, I think you might have tackled it a bit more, but I think it's worth actually exploring a little bit. Jennifer Charlton is asking, can you give us more about including stories from other people that you interviewed for the book, and why, in fact, did you choose to do that?
Yeah, before I answer Jennifer Charlton's question, I just want to come back to that question of Matthew's. One of the huge issues is this concept of what we understand as success. And we're living in an age which success is, I've got to see it, and I've got to see it very quickly. I need, instant gratification. And the work we do, and I talk about it a bit in the book, is I equate it to building cathedrals. You often don't see, you're placing layers. Cathedrals took 4 generations of builder. And so the people in that first wave were creating a foundation and so on, and eventually people benefited from it. And so it is with the work that we do. Is it telling stories, listening to stories, using story is often not a tangible thing, but it might just be either the beginning or the end of a change process in somebody's life. So, coming back to the others, as I said earlier, Paula, is that I thought that it was really important to hear from other voices, to get a sense from other people of their experience of story. And I chose a very eclectic group of people who came from a range of different disciplines, from an academic professor, educator, through to a singer in Zolani, to a cartoonist, etc., etc. So it was just a range of people who, in some ways, brought different narratives. And there were some lovely, anecdotes that people shared with me, which are shared in the book about, just either, there's a wonderful story about the power of assumption. where this beggar who is in Woodstock and begging all the time for food, and then turns down some food because it's not the right brand, it's not coup, it's etc. And the community think, you know, this guy is the most selfish beggar. And then he dies and people come to his funeral, and it turns out that this man all along knew the plight of a Muslim family, and they could only eat certain food. And he didn't want to tell the rest of the community what was going on because he wanted to keep their story. And it was only at his death that they realized that this guy was not he wasn't a selfish sort of difficult person. He was doing this out of love. That's a lovely story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and really teaches that lesson of assumption, right? The poverty of assumption really, really well. Eddie Phillips is saying, I appreciate your contribution to improved health. Are we busy writing the end poverty and injustice story? And what is your storyboard, Garth, for that to happen?
Sure.
It's a big question.
Yeah, as I was saying, maybe we deal with global warming, Paula, you know?
After this, Garth, after this.
No, I mean, I think that the reality is, I honestly just believe that and this sort of comes back to this thing about, yes, systems need to change, and there are big solutions and governments and leaders. But I just think this concept of each of us have such a role to play in our own daily lives, about how we treat the environment, how we treat people around us. I mean, I read a fascinating statistic the other day, which I can't remember the exact thing, but in a person's lifetime, without knowing it, you're going to influence like literally thousands of people. And it doesn't matter whether, you might be the most unspoken thing. Everybody's influence is critical. And so it starts with me. And so when I say, what's the big contribution I'm going to make? Well, clearly to do what I can do in my life to make the difference where I can make a difference. And whether that's a big or small difference comes back to the cathedral analogy. We don't often know. The writer, John White, who wrote the books that influenced me, he wrote those in the 1950s. I hadn't even been born yet. And yet he influenced me in the 70s to become a doctor in the 80s, and so on.
So someone has asked, you recommend that people look back at their own stories to learn more about themselves. So where would you suggest we start, and how would you go about that process?
So, I mean, I can only share what I learned, which was literally, first of all, to take some time out and to take a book and, or an exercise pad or something, and literally start writing from your earliest memories and write. That's what I did. And it's amazing that once I started, is that somehow little incidents then spark another memory, and things begin to sort of have a life of their own. And I speak to a number of people who say, I can't remember anything before I was about 6 years old. But invariably there are little pieces, and then when you remember that piece, another memory, and it's often a sight or a sound or something. So I think literally you're not writing for anybody else, you're writing for yourself. So it doesn't have to be a literary thing, you just write. And then I think it's important to reflect back on these, particularly the hard times, and see where you are. And as I say, I love what Deborah Kirsten has done, this thing of you actually plot the low times on your life, and then you turn your piece of paper upside down. And so your low times, you actually understand were really triumphs because you got through those low times. So yeah, you just need to start. It's what Alison Lowry told me when I started writing this book. She said, Garth, just start writing and I'll look and things. So yeah.
Yeah. Then I like to use the phrase writers write, right? I mean, it doesn't get written for you. John Gerald Clark says he has a favorite quote from Ben Okri, which is an exhortation against stories that are lies. So many books I read just don't ring true and seem to be coming from a false narrative that has been expertly marketed. So how do we discern the false narratives? And I think this is such a critical question in this age of misinformation and disinformation, Garth. So, You know, authenticity, I imagine, matters. Well, I believe authenticity matters when we're talking about social and behavior change. But how do we as readers actually know when it's being authentic and when it's not false?
Geez, Paula, this is more in your realm of expertise. I'm placing the question back to you and saying, Paula, what do you think? Because you're certainly one of the leaders in certainly in training of journalists and others. So I'd actually be interested to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, I suppose, it's about who's the source. For me is often, who's written this? Where's this coming from? And do I trust the source? So yeah, I mean, the problem with a lot of media out there is that we unfortunately, we're yin and yang. We like the lowest common denominator, and anything which is why the sort of concept that good news doesn't sell. But yeah, I suppose for me it probably comes back to the integrity of the source. So maybe Paula, you could just answer that.
Perhaps on another day, Garth, but we've
Another
got so
day.
many questions. It is,
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredible. And I love questions that are coming from the audience because sometimes I'm too polite or rather I just don't want to ask something because I think that we've spoken about it before. But I really love hearing your answers. Sichle Moy is asking, why do we so often neglect the power of storytelling? Why is it, and I suppose I would add to that, why do people undermine the power of storytelling?
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing, actually. And I think what we're seeing is a resurgence of it. There's a Harvard professor who I quote in the book sort of asked, why use story in your marketing or in your business and et cetera. And he said, simple, because nothing else works. So I think there's this, isn't it crazy that, as long as humans have been around and we crawled out of the caves, that is how we have understood our lives, our place in the world. We've taught our children what is dear to us, what is permitted and what is not permitted. It's, as again, comes back to the title of the book. It's like water is to fish. It's all around us. And, we're so keen to look at the next great thing, the next business book, the next, breakthrough, that stuff that is actually part of our DNA is we sort of needing to rediscover. And I do believe that we are rediscovering it. I think there is many better books than mine on the power of story. And I think increasingly, like if Harvard says it's good, then it must be good. And you're beginning to get places like that teaching it in business school, which probably would not have happened, 20 years ago.
Garth, how much is too much to share about your story?
I think, and that's a great question, because I mean, part of the what's your story thing, and we used it in our offices and are using it extensively. I think, I don't know how many thousands of people have used what's your story, and we're beginning to use it with international companies as well. And ultimately it's about what you're comfortable with. Is that for some people, sharing just at a superficial level is all they're comfortable with, and that is absolutely fine. To make it sound like this is just really easy. It's not always easy. Hearing somebody's tragic story and then going and having a cup of tea and a biscuit afterwards is really hard. So there's part of me that doesn't want to know your story, because I'm going to feel actually I want to do something about your story, and yet I can't. And so I think we've also got to grapple with that. Is actually, it's the listening. There are a zillion therapists out there that will tell you that actually just listening is healing in its own right. And so, the question was, how much is enough? Well, enough is enough, is how much you think is enough. But in the listening, is also to have the courage to listen and to realize that you don't need to fix everything, that you are doing an amazing thing by simply listening.
And I just also feel it's so critical that we recognize who has ownership of the story, right? whose story it is to tell, whose story it is to decide how much to share, how much not to share, and always to leave that with the person whose story it really is. We've got a couple of comments and a couple of more kind of specific questions. So the first one is from Jennifer, and I'm interested to hear this as well. Can you talk about why Heartlines chose to do film stories, which only come out every few years, rather than the soapies, which kind of longer year-on-year series that Soul City did?
Yeah, so I mean, again, apart from anything else, it's funding. Trying to raise money for the type of work we do is not an easy thing. And Soul City was very much in a sweet spot, which was, you know, it sounds a terrible thing to say, a sweet spot, but essentially where there was a lot of money, particularly around HIV/AIDS. And so we were fortunate to be able to fund sort of dramas. But even the Soul City dramas, they were multi-episode, but they only came out every couple of years. And the difference there, and I use the analogy in the book, is again the difference between two watches. One is a fake Rolex and the other is the real deal. They look the same. They're both, you know, like two films or series will look the same. They're great acting, etc. The one has had, you know, years of listening and thought and checking with the audience and understanding what, you know, using my medical background of saying, first do no harm, because we can do a lot of harm with our stories. And the other is just, you know, make the audience come back for more. And there's a big difference between those two. And so, you know, in Heartlines' case, we were by circumstance have had to do that. But also we found that being able to tell one narrative and use that narrative, like our film Beyond the River, you know, which is based on canoeing, but is actually not about canoeing. It's how these two guys get to know each other's stories in order to compete and win. And how that becomes an analogy for our country, actually, is that we've got to get to put aside our assumptions about each other. We've got to really reach out to listen, to understand in order to compete and win. So, yeah, so a combination of circumstance. I mean, Paula, if you feel like giving me, you know, 15, 20 million rand, or anybody on this call, we'll make a series.
So Garth, we've got about 4 minutes left for four questions, comments. Floyd Babasa is saying, I love this book. Can't wait to read it. Garth, how do you see the next generation, the younger generation like myself, using storytelling to change narratives, as well as helping shape a culture of listening and sharing as a weapon to fight ignorance, especially when it comes to how we disagree with one another?
Sure. Yes, these are hectic questions, Paula.
I know.
Okay. Yes. Tell you what.
I'm envious.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's about being conscious. It's about being thoughtful. It's about being, as I say, it's one of those tools that have been lying around and haven't been picked up properly. And the encouragement really is to pick up the tool and be very conscious about how you use it. You know, is that if I do, you know, I love the thing, but if we in an auditorium, or I'm doing a speech, or there's a sermon or whatever, and the speaker stops and says, let me tell you a story, there's this, you know, immediate, it's like hot-wired into us. So just to understand that within story there is power, and if we are intentional and we think deeply about how to use it, and we check also what other people are hearing from our stories. So a lot of it is this concept of not just telling stories, but listening, and listening to what people are hearing. Because what I tell you, Paula, and what you hear are often different things. So it's a complex question, that, but I think just to acknowledge the fact that when we are emotional beings, we make decisions based on emotion, and our best way of engaging with your emotion is through story.
Will there be a resource or a toolkit to go with the book at some point? That's
sure.
a question.
Is that a question, Paula? Well, maybe we'll speak after this. Paula Frey Incorporated, we can talk. We can talk. I don't. I just, you know, it's as early days, Paula. I just need to see whether people, you know, it works for people. And if the need arises and it is something that people are finding valuable and something like that would work, well then certainly I would be delighted. But I think the key thing is, let's just see how it goes down and whether people really do connect with us or not.
We're still getting questions, I have to tell you, but there are two, and a comment that I just want to mention really quickly. Angela Lamson just gave a comment of her husband starting a weekly Zoom meetings with his team, with a session that he called Who Me, in which every member of the team was given a slot to share their story. He kicked off with sharing some vulnerable stuff about himself, and wow, she says, it opened the floodgates. What began as a 3-minute quick share each week morphed over time into sessions where team members produced PowerPoint presentations to tell their colleagues about things that they'd never shared with one another. And from sharing that they were Springbok coaches in their spare time, to family traumas, to stories about their love pets, and everything in between, says Angela. It was astonishing and liberatory, and the stories they shared were a real awakening for everyone in the team. So a really nice comment from her. But I want to, before we end off, and maybe we'll try and get some other questions after the 7 o'clock cutoff, Francis Thorndike wants to know, where should booksellers place your book in stores, under psychology, writing, or autobiography? Or where do you think?
Jeez. Before I come back to that, then let's just put it on the shelves. I don't mind which shelves it is. Ask Pam Macmillan. You can say, I don't know, they just put it on the shelves. That's cool. Yeah, just on the shelf, or maybe on the pile. I've always wanted to be on that pile. You walk in and there's like a
front table as you walk in.
Yeah. Then they say, "Oh no, this is real." This one I must go for.
Under that, on top of that, number one.
Yes, definitely. That's where this one has to go. Yeah, and so who knows where they put it. But Angela's experience, or her husband's experience, was exactly what spurred What's Your Story. Was our own experience of doing that at Heartlines, and how we've taken that into other areas. And I certainly think, I think as a leader, being able to share my own story with the people around me and being vulnerable, etc., I think has hopefully made me more approachable. I think it is just the fact that we haven't solved each other's problems, but we are aware of each's highs and lows, and that's just changed our dynamic completely, and that's because we've been sharing our stories.
Excellent. And then from Amanda, what do you want your legacy to be, Garth?
Flame, these questions, flaming. What do I want my legacy to be? I don't know. No, essentially, I think I love what Stephen Covey says, is that you must actually live your life about what people are saying at your grave. And it's certainly, what we all want as our legacy is probably is about our relationships. Ultimately, please God, I'm going to be, my kids will think I was a reasonable dad. I probably will stuff up, I'm sure I have, that my wife thinks the same, that my colleagues, felt I was a good friend. Those are important legacy things. Mm-hmm. Whether there was big change in the world, well, that's nice. But ultimately, my legacy is about relationships and about who I was in the world, not what I did. So that's what I'd like to be my legacy.
I know, thank you very much for everyone who's been on so far. I know I've taken up the hour of your time. We've got a couple of more questions, and so I'm going to continue to ask them. I do understand if you need to leave, but I'd love to continue to keep Garth under the spotlight and getting to answer just one or two more questions. So Garth, Lareko Mfono says, you really achieved great success with Soul City and subsequently Heartlines, right? So why did you wait so long to tell this story? And do you think you would have told it differently if you had told the story earlier in the 90s when Soul City was taking off?
Yeah, look, I think there is certainly a degree to feeling that there's a time for every season under heaven. And this, the early days of Soul City was far too early. I'm hoping that there are more chapters to my own story. I'm not finished yet, please God. I don't know, but we'll see. But I think that there's a time, there's a season. And because of the work we were doing about story and using story and whatever, it just felt like this was the right season. And I do feel we get that in life, is that the early days of the 90s in Soul City was far too early. I couldn't have told, this book would not have happened then.
Mm. And then last question before we wrap up, from Craig Ponara, who says, do you think there's a way of impacting the education crisis through story, and not in a simplistic way of teaching stories, but using stories, I suppose? He says, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I still remember going back at school, ultimately the teachers that told us stories were the teachers that we remember, that I still remember to this day, and every subject has the ability to bring out interest. Because as I say, I mean, I make the, the concept of bullet points, the PowerPoints with bullet points. You know why they're called bullet points? Well, because they kill, they're bullets. But if I tell you a story, it's the only way. And I think that a lot of people say, well, I'm not a storyteller. I think there's a storyteller in all of us. And that is often starting with your own experience, because we all have a story to tell. And I think the integrity of this, of being able to be vulnerable and using your story to weave it into your education, to use, I absolutely believe that story is key to teaching, because it's the way that we have taught since we crept out of the caves, as I said before.
Thank you very, very much, Garth. Thank you very much, everyone, for those amazing questions that made me look very bright and intelligent. This is the book. If you haven't seen it, you'll see it's full of notes and marks and stuff. I have not treated it well, simply because it's just been really very, very good to use and read. Please go and get it if you care about stories, if you care about change. I would really encourage you to do it. Thank you, everyone, for giving your questions. Thank you, Garth, for letting me be part of this. I'm really honored to be part of it. There are a couple of more statements in the Q&A that you want to have a look at and maybe respond to. But thank you very much, and congratulations, Garth.
Well, Paula, can I thank you as a friend, as a colleague, as somebody I admire hugely, and just for your time and for just so making this feel like a really comfortable discussion between friends. So thank you, Paula, and to the people at Exclusives and Pan Macmillan, also for just making this possible. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Garth.